We are live. Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to talk about ideological possession and personality disorders. I have to lead by telling you this. I am not formally qualified to speak on the topics that I'm going to discuss today, and with any kind of authority or credentialing or credibility, anything like that, okay? So if that is going to bother you, I would recommend that you go watch something else and don't watch this video. What I'm trying to do in this video is give you information that I wish I knew in the past. I really could have used some of this information and some of this perspective previously in my previous life. And not knowing some of this information has been costly to me and to a lot of people. And that cost is ongoing, okay? So the reason I share this stuff is to help, just trying to help, right? So I'm going to try not to share personal information today, but regardless of my attempt not to share personal information, I don't think that the astute observer or listener will be able to avoid aggregating together what has happened. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. I'm just trying to give you information that I think you can use and can be helpful to try to understand some of the landscape that we operate in. Okay? Some of you might be tempted to think that we're talking about psychology today. And I have to remind you, we're talking about reality, okay? Reality does not come divided into different segments and domains and categories. I was just talking to somebody today. They were objecting to some of my stages of growth stuff. And so I wrote to them. I answered them back. This is over on Facebook. Actually go over there and see it on the Beyond the Fundamentals Facebook page right now. So my response back to them, they're like, well, I don't like psychology, they said, because I just think we need to concern ourselves with spirituality. As if spirituality could possibly exist without tending to the psyche. See, the psyche is a Bible word. It shows up in your New Testament 104 times. You cannot rightly read and study and follow and obey the Bible if you do not also concern yourself with the domain that is formally called psychology. Psychology comes from a Bible word, psyche or suke, depending on how you want to pronounce the Greek. But our word psyche, for the mind, heart, spirit, soul, it's translated different ways, different places, different times, okay? Shows up 104 times. And you can look all those up. So it is a biblical endeavor. Ian McGilchrist says in his book, this is interesting. Chapter 1, right there in chapter 1. Matter of fact, I think I can stick this over here and show this. If I don't get any copyright infringements. If we are interested in truth, quoting Roger Sperry, if we are interested in truth, we ought to be interested in the mind through which it might be apprehended. And that's a lot of Christians running around waving a book saying, we have the truth, we have the truth, we have the truth, we believe in absolute truth. Problem is they don't think about the mind that's apprehending it. Do you think your mind can and has apprehended absolute truth? Until you're willing to claim omniscience and omnipotence, okay? I would back off any claims that you make of having truth, okay? Whatever, you may have truth in your hands, but you certainly have not apprehended it to any significant degree. Like William James said, our ignorance is an ocean, our knowledge is a drop. It's always that way. So no matter how much truth you think you have or you think there is, you haven't apprehended any more than a drop. Mankind as a whole hasn't apprehended any more than a drop, okay? And you're just one of us. So we need to back off of our hubristic religious claims of having truth and having absolute truth. I'm not denying that absolute truth exists. I'm denying that you can get your hands on it in any usable fashion more than anybody else. Okay? Questions such as those concerning scientific truth, the nature of reality, and the place of man in the cosmos require for their study some knowledge of the constitution, quality, capacities, and limitations of the human mind, through which medium all such problems must be handled. Whatever problems you're dealing with, your human mind's going to, and I hear you, I know some of you out there, well, I'm led by the Spirit. I don't rely on my human mind. Okay. You guys should probably turn the video off too. Go watch something else. Okay? I'm trying to help people who are trying to make a difference, okay? Who are willing to apply themselves to love the Lord their God with all their mind and apply themselves to try to help make a difference to address some of the perennial problems that we have. And you and I believe, can make a big difference. If we are interested in the capacities and limitations of the mind, we should be interested in the capacities and limitations of the brain. So right there in chapter 1, that is where Ian McGilchrist gets started, right there in chapter 1. I'm going to minimize that. Going back to there, now let's look at some of our information. I've had discussions here in the past with Doug Gustafson. And we've talked about Calvinism and narcissism, the link between those. We've examined those. We've talked about Calvinism and narcissism. We've examined that, and then borrowing power in Calvinism. And Doug is a trained therapist, and I'm not going to pretend to speak for him. I'm not going to try to borrow his credentials or expertise for this video, but I will say that we have. I've been exploring this concept and this relationship between ideological possession and personality disorders, specifically cluster B ones, for quite a while. And I have a theory, a thesis. Somebody encouraged me recently to go get advanced degrees in psychology, and I might do that, and this might be the thesis that I focus on, is the relationship between ideological possession. I think for a healthy person who's not affected by any personality disorders from birth or childhood, whatever you might call it, they might, I think, ideological possession, like becoming a Calvinist or a provisionist or a dispensationalist or an amillennialist, becoming hardcore radicalized version of any of these kinds of things can cause a person to manifest the traits of cluster B personality disorders. Roddy says Doug is an awesome guy. I totally agree. Totally agree. Doug's pretty amazing. I've been, I like to take an aggregate of things and look through multiple different sets of lenses, okay? Might look at modes of discovery. You also get this from Ian McGilchrist, the 4 kinds of knowing, 4E cognition, ego and attachments. We're going to be looking at that today also. The big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, multiple intelligences that we have, moral foundation theory. These are all lenses that you can put on to help look at a particular situation. And for any one situation, you might take turns putting on all these lenses in order. And then you'll see that they cascade. Like if you take the modes of discovery, science, intuition, reason, and imagination, you could take the 4 kinds of knowing could cascade from each of these separately. So with regard to science, there's proposition, procedure, perspectival, participatory. With regard to intuition, there's proposition, and on we go, you see? So a lot of these cascade and fit together in the same way. Salience landscaping, relevance realization, what Ian McGilchrist would call attending. These are Vervaekian terms here, okay? Having vision, strategy, and culture is a bonded triad because we're trying to press toward the mark and see where we're going. We have things like predictive processing, and you know that your ideology or worldview has some kind of realness to it if you can accurately predict your reality. If you can, whenever you try to have agency in the world, if things come about as you intend them to or expect them to, it's an idea that perhaps your worldview might have some validity or plausibility to it. Meaning has 4 components: purpose, coherence, significance, and mattering. The hemisphere issue is a huge one, okay? The timing of things. We talked about kaleidoscopic consciousness last night, so I threw that down here. So these are some of the lenses that I put on. Why am I talking about this today? Really, the reason I'm talking about this is simply for the sake of discernment. I want you to gain literacy in the interactive realm of reality. I want you to be able to encounter people and things and ideas and interactions and kind of get a sense for what's going on and what you're dealing with, all right? There is like when it comes to the stages of faith, stages of development, the word faith on here should not confuse you to make you think that that is like a religious advancement or sanctification per se. It is human development as like going from a child to an adolescent to an adult, that kind of thing, but extended throughout one's lifetime. And he just happens to use the word faith there, but he uses it like Tillich uses it as a reference to the ground of being, not a sense of all the religious propositions that you have affirmed is true. It's a different kind of thing. When you gain literacy in some developmental stage theories like this one, or like integral theory or spiral dynamics, which integral theory leans on spiral dynamics a lot. When you gain some literacy there, you start to see these things, you start to be able to interpret reality and see things through a certain set of lenses that are helpful. For any of these models, we're not saying any of them are true. What we would say is, like the scientists say, all models are wrong, some are useful. So we look at everything that way. All models are wrong, some are useful. Even when it comes down to things like systematic theology, okay? All models are wrong, some are useful. Now, I happen to think when it comes to systematic theology that there is more harm than good that comes from them, okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I have other videos on that I'm not going to get into here. So if you want to make comments on that, I would advise you to do it on those videos, not this one. So the reason for personality disorders that I think you need to understand these things is that they are real. They are real things, okay? Imagine you had, here's what I don't want to do today. I don't want to stigmatize anybody. I don't want anybody to feel like they're less of a person if you happen to have some kind of mental health diagnosis. I have been diagnosed with things like depression and anxiety disorder. I was diagnosed with some things at a different point in my life. When situations change, they're like, oh, you don't have that at all, okay? So sometimes situations can manifest things. Now, let me tell you the background that I came from. And my wife came from an Assemblies of God background, and they were not in favor of any kind of psychologists or anything like that, okay? Well, in the Baptist church, the way we viewed psychology was it was a set of inventions of the sinful mind whereby we might excuse our proclivities to sin and justify our tendencies to continue sinning. That was really how we saw psychology. We just completely reduced it to people going through elaborate lengths to try to find reasons to justify and continue their sin. That's really what we thought. And when it came down to any problems with the mind, we reduced everything down to essentially sin, demons, and prayer. You were sinful, God might be judging you, or you're latching onto your sin too much and it's causing you to be bitter, blah, blah, blah. We had all kinds of reasons. It could be demons. You might be demon possessed or affected by the demon. You could have got the Kundalini spirit. And then everything could be fixed by repentance and prayer. And, it was a little set of really low-key spiritual disciplines that were supposed to fix all this kind of stuff. And I do think an ecology of praxis can help fix this kind of stuff, but the shallowness that they were throwing at us is not appropriate. It's not effective. And it sets you up to think. When you think that psychology is an invention of sinful people so that they can justify their continued sin, trying to get my chair straightened up here. And when you think that all these problems can be fixed by repenting of your sin, cleansing yourself of demons, and praying and all that, when you think that, you go into adulthood thinking that you will be able to, through your righteous representation as an ambassador of Christ, you will be able to overcome all the mental illness you encounter because you know what it means to be right with God. And guess what? When the personality disorders hit, they come in like a hurricane or a tornado, and you find out that you had no idea what you were talking about. And you are not right with God, and you can't help. That's what you find out. And you find it out the hard way. Okay? Now, some of you, you're in this religious fundamentalist situation, and it seems to be working for you. Okay? And honest to God, I hope it just keeps working for you. I really do. I really do hope that you never, if you think that psychology is an invention of sinful people to justify their sin, and that everything can be solved through repenting of sin, cleansing yourself of demons in prayer, and then you have a pretty smooth life, and that's your mindset, I hope you keep having a smooth life. I really do. I really do. I hope you never have to learn lessons the hard way. Because when you encounter the things, it's like Jordan Peterson says, take a real tragedy and turn it into a hell. You can really do that. So if you wind up dying, never having faced some of these issues, and you never had to learn about them, and you're just fine, great, more power to you. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Your kids and their kids and their kids are not going to have that story. It's just not going to happen. Okay? And we need to have a literacy in this area. Here's what they did in the Assemblies of God church, according to my wife. They would take the word therapist and they would separate it right here into the rapist. And their idea was that people were being spiritually and mentally raped by therapists in these situations. I just got a text from my wife and thought that it might be pertaining to what I'm talking about here, but it was not. So that's not the right attitude to have. And when you take this approach toward the concept of psychology, what you do is you take an entire domain of reality and you blacken it out and fog it over for people, and you are setting them up to be blindsided by it later in life. That's what you're doing. Because what you're teaching is wrong. It's not true. It does not correspond with reality. Okay? So the domains of inquiry do not occur in a vacuum. Okay? Theology, psychology, spirituality. Did I already read this to you? Here, what I responded to the guy on Facebook, I said the stages of development can be pulled strictly from Scripture. Pressing toward the mark, Philippians 3:14, is not a strictly psychological endeavor. Because he was trying to say that, pursuing stages of development is like an isolated, exclusively psychological effort, endeavor. And that's one of the dumbest things I've read in 8 months. Okay? It is one of the most spiritual things you could possibly do, is endeavor to grow. And he was trying to say that trying to grow is not spiritual, and that you have to be spiritual, not grow, because growing is psychology. I don't know. It doesn't even make sense. I don't even know why. I don't know why some people try to oppose what I'm saying. I'm just trying to help people here. All right? So if you want to oppose what I'm saying, please have something helpful and substantive to say, not moralistic platitudes and reducing everything down to some spiritualized, moralistic, religious statement that's going to, wish all this away and make it all go away. It doesn't work that way. Pressing toward the mark, Philippians 3:14, is not a strictly psychological endeavor. It is also a spiritual one. Reality does not come divided up into different domains. In my kitchen, there isn't an exclusively spiritual section and then another section that's exclusively psychological. Reality comes all together. The different categories are something that we have taxonomized. Okay? It's not possible to study the psychology of a person without also reflecting spirituality. Psyche is a Bible word that is used about 104 times in the New Testament. The intentional study of that word as it relates to us is formally called psychology. However, doing so does not exclude spirituality. In fact, it's impossible to study either without the other. Paul wants his audience to grow up in Ephesians 4:15 into a certain capacity that can function in an Ephesians 4:16 edification environment. Those who have grown up to do so are at a further degree of development than those who still rely on Ephesians 4:11 through 12 modality of edification. Paul prays that his audience may be able to comprehend, Ephesians 3:18, certain things, and that increasing ability to comprehend comes with growth. Paul was eager to attain, Philippians 3:11, something that he had not already attained, Philippians 3:12, which is why he was pressing toward the mark, verse 14, and this is the mind that should also be in his audience, Philippians 3:15 through 16. This literally is spirituality. Growth models simply help people identify the mark toward which they are also pressing. So when I say this comment over here on why are we talking about this today, it's because domains of inquiry, such as psychology or philosophy or theology, they don't happen in a vacuum, okay? The divisions that we have divided up fields of study into, reality doesn't come that way. Reality comes all as one, okay? What we used to say in the Army, colorless core. It's all coming through the same pipe. So what I want to help produce is an increase in your interactive and functional literacy when you're dealing with people. Know what they are. My wife gets a call from somebody every now and then, and she answers the phone, and it's this little girl who I think is playing with her mother's phone, and the little girl probably, it sounds like she thinks she's calling her own grandmother or relative or something like that, okay? Because she talks and she's just as sweet as can be, but we can know immediately. We can know immediately that that's like a little 4 or 5 year old girl. We know we're not talking to a college educated adult. We know we're not talking to a 15-year-old, you see? We're talking to a little girl. We can know this just from hearing the voice, okay? And when you become familiar with this, with different models of development or some psychological issues such as some personality disorders or whatnot, sometimes just as quickly you can ascertain kind of where a person is on some of these spectrums. I am not advocating that we walk around psychoanalyzing people. What I'm advocating is that you develop a fluency and a literacy with some of the information. Learn how to recognize some things for your own sake. What I do not want happening with anybody, and a lot of people do this, is they know a little bit about a particular domain and they start weaponizing it, hitting people over the head with it. Husbands and wives tend to do this all the time with the Bible. They will quote the Bible at each other and tell them what they're supposed to be doing as a husband and wife or a father or a mother, that kind of thing. You're not pleasing God, blah, 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 blah. Try to borrow power from God for what their spouse should be doing. And then if you teach those same kinds of people a few psychological terms, guess what they're going to do? They're going to weaponize those against their spouse, okay? That's not the kind of people we want to be. We don't want to see these kinds of things as weapons that we hurl at each other to try to tell everybody else how ate up they are. All right, that's an Army terminology there. 11 up, 3 down. It's 8 up. All right? You'd be 8 up as a football bat doing cheetah flips out there in the back 40. That's what will be happening to you. We don't want that happening to anybody. So I want to increase your interactive functional literacy. If I was, right now my wife and I we play volleyball. We meet a lot of people. We're exposed to a lot of people. And there are some people that we encounter who are like within minutes, certainly within a week or two. I'm like, if I was on the dating scene again, for whatever reason, and I met this person, I would not give them the time of day. Romantically, that is, I would not be interested in them at all, because even though they might be sweet and cute and all that kind of stuff up front, I have a little bit of literacy in this kind of stuff now, to where I can perceive that there's something there that I don't want. Whether or not it's diagnosed, it's another matter. Okay. Now, if I had known that, if I'd have had that kind of literacy when I was younger, when I was, say, 20, 19, 21, somewhere around there, there's a lot of mistakes I could have avoided, and would known have avoided very quickly. It wouldn't have taken me long, and I would have been able to spot major decisional errors that I made, and I would know why, and they wouldn't have haunted me well, they're still haunting me. So that wouldn't have been going on. I would have been able to spot these things quickly. Okay. So what I want for you is to increase some of you have decisions coming your way, and I want you to know what you're getting into when you make decisions. Like, should I join this church? Should I be part of this group? You can hang out with the people a little bit. You can kind of see what they're made of, and you can see if you can spot some of these things. You get a feeling for what kind of degree of development the people are at, or the person is at. Say you're a young man or a young lady considering getting married. Say you're 50 and considering getting married. Okay, you need to know what you're getting into with some of this stuff and what you're in for. Now, there's a high likelihood that you are going to encounter people who either aren't very developed, or possibly who have some kind of mental illness or personality disorder at work, or in your family, and your children. Your children could be born with some stuff. Society, friends, your social environment, okay, is things you need to know before you lock horns with somebody in marriage. Put on the old ball and chain. Before you do that, you need to know what you're getting into. Now, one of my thesis that I'm dealing with this kind of information, is that ideological possession, like hardcore Calvinist, hardcore provisionist, that kind of thing, can precipitate symptoms of personality disorders. Okay? Now, I'll go ahead and admit something to you here. Here's what I'm going to admit to you. I've seen a lot of mental health professionals over the past few years, and they all guarantee me that I'm not a narcissist or anything like that, right? And I'll tell you why that's relevant later. When I was leading a Bible study back in 2008, 2009, somewhere around there in Italy, and there was a dentist there who was coming, who was, I don't know, late 40s, early 50s, I guess. And I was hardcore dispensationalist, pre-trib, pre-millennial, Ruckmanite, Independent Baptist, King James only, advocating certain kinds of music to the exclusion of others. I mean, all this stuff was going on. And this guy was a Jew who had turned to Christ by reading Matthew 7:1, interestingly. And so we're discussing some of these things, and with regard to my view on these things, he called me a narcissist. And I stood there. I said, "Well, okay, I appreciate your opinion. You don't have to come." I mean, there was no. I don't get heated. I don't get upset with people and yell and scream or anything like that. So I'm like, okay, well, I appreciate you telling me that. I don't know what to do with that information. Don't even know what that is. Now, in hindsight, I don't think that I really am a narcissist, but And I'm not here to defend that. It's just the point is, in hindsight, I can see why he would say that. And with regard to those religious viewpoints and standpoints, I probably functionally was. Does that make sense? Okay? I probably functionally was, because of being hardcore devoted to those certain kinds of ideological things at the propositional level, having them all semantically disambiguated, blah, 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 blah. He was probably right when he said that. Right? Now, that's kind of reason. So when I say that ideological possession can precipitate symptoms of personality disorders, what I'm trying to do by telling you that story is I'm including myself in that. Okay? Ideological possession did that to me, right? And coming out of the ideology was exactly the cure that I needed. Okay? Get back to being my old self again, which is wonderful, if you hadn't noticed. In Ephesians 5:12, says, going through chapter 6, verse 2, "For when the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again." What I'm honing in on down here is this word exercising, having your senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Why am I highlighting that? Because I want you to be able to discernment about what you're getting into when you're dealing with people. So ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles, the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. For everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth unto them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Therefore, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ, let us go on unto perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God, of the doctrine of baptisms and laying on of hands and the resurrection of the dead and eternal judgment. So the writer of Hebrews does not want us hanging around all these things forever. Let's move on. Let us go on, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ. Let's go beyond this stuff. That's the starting point. That's not the end point. We tend to think, when we're fundamentalists, we tend to think that getting people to the correct doctrine of Christ is the end point. No, it's the starting point. It's the starting point, and then we go on from there, is what we're trying to do. In order to go on from there, you're going to need to be able to handle some meat, which means you're going to need to be able to exercise your senses, have your senses exercised to discern both good and evil. That's not an option. We need to know the big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. To help easily remember it, it spells the acronym OCEAN. That's what I use to remember it by. Okay? You can hear Jordan Peterson say a lot of these things. And so if you know what these are when you're talking to somebody, no assessment of stages of faith, no assessment or spiral dynamics or whatever, no assessment of no psychoanalysis of anything, you can tell pretty quick where they fall on these big 5, which is helpful. Well, I'm dealing with somebody who's very open. Oh, this very conscientious. They take jobs very seriously. What is right matters to them, and if you give them a job, they're going to finish it to its completeness. Okay. Extroversion, introversion is on the spectrum of extroversion. Okay, so it's not like introversion is a different kind of thing. It's just a lack of extroversion kind of thing. Agreeableness and neuroticism. And agreeableness is how willing you are to agree with something versus how willing you are to disagree. What your tendency to disagree is. And then neuroticism. And these kinds of things, neuroticism is negative emotion, trait neuroticism. So these things have been studied to a great degree, and there's all kinds of things. You can hear people like Jordan Peterson talking about these, saying things like, the most men are slightly more disagreeable than women on average. That's one of the reasons why there's more men in prisons. And but usually the detection on this is at the extremes. Like the most disagreeable people are men. They're more disagreeable is what I meant to say if I didn't say that. And the most agreeable people are women. But average people, there's there are women who are more disagreeable than some men, that kind of thing, okay? So you can't generalize too much, but as a whole, men tend to be more disagreeable than women to a slight degree. It's not a huge difference, to a slight degree. On the ends of the distribution curve is where it really matters. So if you go to the Mayo Clinic website or pretty much any psychological website, medical website, you will find 3 different clusters of personality disorders. There are group A personality disorders, and I'm going to be talking about group B today, and there are group C personality disorders. Okay, here you have the paranoid, schizoid, schizotypal. C is avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. And B is what we're talking about today. Could be borderline personality disorder, right? Histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. And it just so happens that if you get locked into an ideology such as Calvinism or provisionism and you become super radical in these things, you will tend to exhibit traits of narcissism or cluster B in general, like the splitting and things that go on like that. I was having a discussion with a therapist. It wasn't a paid session. It's somebody that I know personally. And I scribbled this thing out on this envelope. And it kind of served as the basis or foundation or set of seed thoughts for what I want to share with you today. So I've converted some of these drawings over to PowerPoint, okay? And we'll be talking about those in a few minutes. If you are dealing with somebody who has borderline personality disorders, I would recommend that you read this book here to understand what's happening. It's called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. And if you want to gain some skills in how to interact with such people, I would recommend this book over here, the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills Workbook, which I have on my shelf right up here above me. Actually, I don't see it, but that's not the point. I must have put it somewhere else. But those are the book recommendations that I would give you. If you're talking to somebody who is ideologically possessed, I would advise you to read this book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. If you're talking to a hardcore Calvinist, flat earther, global warming alarmist, whatever, doesn't matter what it is. This book has some very helpful tips in how to deal with somebody who has a high confidence margin in what they are asserting without any epistemic basis for doing so. Okay? So that's, the 5th kind of knowing is PowerPoint. Thanks, John. That's true. So let's get into these diagrams and talk about what we're looking at here. If you're looking at this blue line in the middle, let me get rid of this Chiron graphic here. This blue line in the middle represents what we might call a normal range of mood. Now, I don't want to use the word normal because it might sound stigmatizing. Some people are normal, some people are not. But the people who aren't affected by any kind of personality disorder, we're going to call this like a normal range of mood, self-esteem, need for validation, especially external validation. So we're going to say that phrase a lot, okay? And that's where they are. We're going to call, that's the normal line, okay? Not diagnosed, not affected, just a regular person, no personality disorder. That's that blue line. Now a narcissist, their self-esteem, notice this red arrow up here, their range of esteem and validation is way up here. It's way above normal. So their view of themselves is very inflated. Their esteem of themselves is very inflated. It's very high. And they have an inflated sense of self and an inflated sense of self-prime. Okay? And so let's introduce what self-prime is real quick. Self and self-prime. I have these diagrams here, and these diagrams come from the Stages of Faith book in the early chapters. And all I've done is I've just recreated them and blown them up here. When you're this S, we'll look at all 3 of these. Let's deal with this one first. This S, okay, is self, that stands for self, and the O over on the right represents others. So you are relating to another person. Now, as soon as you do that, you create a little mental image in your head of how you think they perceive you, okay? So we're going to call your self-perception is self, but how you think they perceive you is what we're going to call self-prime, okay? So you might be say you're a con artist, okay, and you just met somebody, and you're trying to act like, I don't know, whatever you are. You don't want them to know you're a con artist. So your perception of yourself, you know they're trying to steal your stuff, but you're trying your self-prime, your intended projection of a self-prime is a nice, trustworthy guy, right? At least temporarily. And so we have lots of different self-primes, okay? So when my wife is the other, my imagination of how she perceives me is very, very different than the self-prime for how my coworkers deal with me, or how my children deal with me, or people on FSI, that kind of thing. So there are actually multiple different personalities, multiple different self-primes that I have in different roles that I have, or the reasons for different friendships. Like I have some friends where we go out to dinner and we sing karaoke, and I have some friends where we sit around and talk about really deep philosophical things all the time, okay? And so my self-prime to those different kinds of friend groups are very different. It's a very different kind of thing. So you need to be aware of that, and you may have an attachment, like an identity attachment to some of your self-primes that is stronger than some of the other ones. And that's a good one to understand as well. Now, your self-prime might not be accurate. What you think they think of you may not be accurate. And this is one of the problems with the whole the gender identity thing that's going on right now. Because your identity is a negotiation between you and others. And you actually cannot control your self-prime. You can control your image of it, and you might say, well, I want you to call me XYZ. They don't think of you that way. They may think they're being polite when they call you what you want to be called, but that doesn't mean that they think of you that way, okay? So your real identity is, what you would want to do ideally is have your self-image or your self-prime image match the other person's perception of you as closely as possible. You want your self-prime to be an accurate depiction of how they perceive you to the greatest degree possible. And I would think that most of us probably have somewhat of an inflated self-prime when we're dealing with other people. And a narcissist would have a very inflated self-prime, very highly inflated self-prime. Now, then the next thing you're going to notice is, we'll talk about this other diagram. It's just the same thing back and forth. Since I know that I have an idea of what the other person thinks of me as, I also know what I think of them, and I also know that they have an idea of how they think they're presenting themselves to me, what you might call the other prime. Now, the other prime, the other that I perceive, and the other prime that's in their head, they might match or they might not match. What you would want is for your prime, the prime and the actual perception, to be as congruent as possible. And all these things are all happening subconsciously in your head. When you meet people, this is all going on. You're not even aware that it's going on, but it's helpful to know that this is happening, because when you're dealing with somebody who has a personality disorder, the self-primes, like for a narcissist, it's going to be very high. For a BPD person, their self-prime is very low. You might actually think, oh, this is a pretty squared away person here, but they think that you think they're dumb and incompetent and stupid. That's what their self-prime version of their self in their head from your perspective is, okay? So when I say self-prime, that is your image in your head of what you think they perceive you as. And then when another person gets involved, as a third person, now there's, you can imagine a self-prime for that person, and then you imagine that they have an other prime for the other person too, and for you, and they're putting them together. This might not make too big of a deal, but there were two people that worked on my team when I was at Marforez, and to me, I grouped them together. My perception of them was that they were Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They weren't bad people. They just weren't exceptional. And they did their job. Well, one of them kept being Tweedledee and Tweedledum. The other one kept getting certifications, kept getting promoted, and hired themselves out and tripled their income, that kind of thing. And I'm like, I had to realize that just because these two guys hung out all the time, I had perceived them as pretty much the same. They were very different. So my perception of them was wrong. All right. So you never know. You never know how the perception of something can be wrong. So that is the prime issue. We need to be aware of where that is, okay? So a narcissist is going to have a very inflated self-prime, okay? And I have a little one there. I guess it's supposed to be like a little apostrophe or something. I don't think it matters. So when you see a S or a self with the one or the apostrophe, that's what I'm talking about, is that self-prime. And they have an overly secure projection, like, I'm all that in a bag of chips. But it actually happens to be fragile. All of the value, so if you've ever seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, this guy, like, he knows he's not a doctor. He's being Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. Great movie. Watch it if you get a chance. Leonardo DiCaprio, he's pretending to be a pilot. He's pretending to be a lawyer, pretending to be a doctor. He's pretending to be all these things. And so his self-prime is a doctor. But his self, he knows him to be, is not. That kind of thing, okay? So their projection of themselves is very overly secure, but in reality, their perception is very fragile, and that brings in the fact that they constantly need, if you look at this phrase over here, I might move this and just add it to this slide. The validation that they get, this is like a pump that always needs to be filled up, like an empty glass that has holes in the bottom of it. And they need validation in order to keep this vial full of validation waters, okay? And that validation has to come from the outside. That's one of the problems with cluster B people. There is no internal validation. There's a place in the Bible where it says, and David encouraged himself, okay? These people cannot do that. They're not going to encourage themselves. It has to come from outside. What that means is that they are constantly relying on other people for validation. They're like an emotional black hole. And this guy, this narcissist over here, he is constantly sucking up validation from other people to keep that inflated version of himself full. And if anybody is in his life that is providing that validation, keeping that validation there, they are going to be the hero, the best friend, lots of fun. As soon as that validation supply runs dry, you are an enemy number one, okay? You are the devil. And it is not fun to be around them, all right? So the validation for a narcissist must be constantly sought out and supplied from outside, from other people, to keep them in that inflated version of themselves. Now, the borderline has the kind of the opposite problem, but the same thing is happening. Their self-prime is very deflated. They're very insecure, and they constantly think that their identity is like an exposed nerve. And everything that happens, they perceive it as it has something to do with them, and it probably means somebody doesn't like them or disapproves of them, and someone probably thinks they're stupid or ugly or aren't good at something, they interpret everything that way. Now, so they are always operating at a deficit. Narcissist always wants to operate at a surplus. The borderline is always operating at a deficit. And again, they need validation, okay, from others. They need validation from others. So let's put this arrow down here. Has to come from outside. Has to come from outside. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that the relationships in the life, for both of these, they're going to be really good at first, and there's going to come a time when that external validation does not get supplied as it's needed by them, and then things are not good at all. Okay? Now, one of the differences between a cluster A and cluster B is a cluster A personality disorder. It will occur all the time, anytime. And there's some things that aren't on here, like bipolar is not on here. If somebody's having a bipolar, like a manic episode, they're going to have their manic episode. Doesn't matter if they're on an airplane, doesn't matter if they're with strangers, doesn't matter. It's happening, it's happening. The difference with cluster B, okay, is that they manifest themselves in relationships, okay? So all the surface level acquaintances, the people you know at work, on a shallow basis, the people you maybe say hi to every day, the gas station clerk, none of those people are going to suspect anything is wrong. You're just as normal as can be, and they probably think you're either sweet or charming or wonderful or virtuous. They probably have all kinds. Your self-prime is high at the acquaintance level, okay? But for the people who know you well, it's problematic. So cluster B personality disorders manifest themselves in relationships primarily. And the cluster B person is constantly sucking people into their narrative, to their story, what they have going on. Why? Because they need all this external validation. Now the danger here is that if you want external validation from me, right? I'm a grown man. I'm 45 years old. If I don't want to give you external validation, I have boundaries. And I'm going to say, no, I'm not providing that to you. Or I might even be frank or forward with somebody to the point where they know that I'm not just going to sit around and flatter them the whole time. They're going to be fishing for compliments and stuff like that. Fishing for validation. You know, play a volleyball game. Oh, you probably think I'm terrible at this, you know. I'm not even going to answer that. I'm not playing that game. I'm not going there. I'm not doing that. The problem, though, as a grown man who understands these things at the age of 45, problems of children in their life, okay? Children are absolutely helpless and defenseless against this. Me, at the age of 37 and 38, was absolutely defenseless against this. I had no idea what was going on. Okay? Had no idea. And the cluster B person, especially the borderline, their kids are going to be using their kids for their supply, for their external validation supply. And it's a very toxic thing. And I can't stress how it negatively affects. Now that kind of brings us to an issue of how cluster B personality disorders come about. How do they come about? And the short answer is there's not a really good answer. Okay? They think that maybe there's a genetic component, and they think that there is a nurturing component. The nurture nature kind of thing. It's both, right? And what they've done is they've linked together how mothers deal with their children. And if a mother, for example, when the child is at a certain age range, if they are demanding too much attention, when the child is no longer able or willing to give that attention, but the mother is demanding it anyway, like the mother's getting external validation, oh, I'm making the baby laugh. Well, now, the baby's tired of playing peekaboo, and the baby's ready to go do something else or take a nap. Well, the mom's not done getting the external validation she needs from the baby laughing at her peekaboo game. So she keeps it going anyway. And then the baby starts crying, and then she starts getting frustrated and starts trying to force the baby to do things, that kind of thing. 1 or 2 episodes, not a huge deal if this kind of thing is happening all the time. And on the reverse side, there'll be a tendency for the baby needs attention and isn't getting it, or the baby wants to play and the mom's not interested. So what will happen with a parent that already has either a cluster B personality disorder themselves or they are suffering from trauma, there's going to be an attentional inappropriateness at a certain age. They're giving too much attention at the wrong time. They're not giving enough attention at the right times. That kind of thing is the nature nurture component, and many others like that. Okay, that's just one example. Lots of things like that tend to brew or breed this sort of thing in a child and perpetuate it and keep it going in the next generation. Now, also a mother who has maybe not a cluster B personality disorder, but maybe they are suffering from some kind of trauma. It could be acute trauma, like some kind of maybe they were kidnapped, maybe they were beat, maybe they were abused, maybe there was some sexual abuse, maybe there's something like that. If there is something like that, then the mother, or if they could, instead of loving the baby becomes that adult's transition object, like a security blanket, and they form a trauma bond with that kid instead of a proper nurturing relationship. And then you have attachment disorders, all kinds of things that come out of that. All these things can go back to childhood. And this is all the kind of stuff when I was, they've got some comments coming over here. When I was a Baptist, I thought this was people trying to excuse their sin by blaming all this stuff on them, on their parents or in early childhood. We've got a couple of comments here. Stephen Vading says, I was listening to Ted Mashburn yesterday. He said psychology was oriented to speculative study, which falls under the arts domain in the academy. I wonder how well we serve that ethos, putting in science. This content is very resourceful, especially when it comes to dealing with a late bloomer teenager and how he interacts with his developing peers. My Psych 101 professor always said most people were like a stick of mental disorder dynamite. It just depends on whose fuse does or doesn't get lit by any number of factors. That makes a lot of sense right there. And I can look back on my own life and I can see how things could have gone very differently at different times depending on different inputs. I also see, like, I had a brother. So my brother, coming from the same parents, is 2 years older than me. He was a lot more impulsive than I was. And his impulsivity got him into some trouble sometimes. He died 13 years ago. But having that to look at, having a brother to watch, it's like basically getting to watch a movie of myself in that particular situation. And I can learn, wow, maybe don't be so impulsive, so, and you also realize what you're capable of. Like, I could make those choices and do those things and have the same urges, and that could be how it goes down. The study desk says, can you do one about Christians who have antisocial personality disorder, sociopath? I don't feel qualified to be to do those, but I'd be happy to research it and bring in maybe an expert to also talk about those kinds of things. What I'm telling you about is things that I've had to learn about myself because of the situations that I've been in, and I think that expanding that and learning about all three clusters, what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, all those kinds of things. Antisocial is another cluster B, along with histrionic. Yeah, I think we should learn about all those. I don't think that I'm necessarily the one to learn about it, but I think that to learn from on really any of this. But yeah, it's good to see that there's a desire and a curiosity to learn about it there. So the problem with this validation having to be provided by others, It's really bad when kids are involved because kids aren't as good as adults at putting up boundaries and knowing when to stop. Okay, they can't say no. They're in a situation where they have to do what their parents tell them. So that's a real situation that people need to keep their eyes on. And if kids can be delivered from that situation, it needs to happen whenever possible. So because I don't know what to call this. I actually asked ChatGPT. How do I refer to people who don't have personality disorders? Because I don't want to use the word normal, implying that other people are abnormal. Because the BPD is a bottomless pit of insatiable need for external validation, people in this blue range here have a difficult time continuing to show empathy for their concerns. Because of this, they are perceived as non-empathetic to the BPD and are effectively narcissistic from their perspective. What do you mean by this? So down here, the BPD person is so underinflated, like that everything gets to them. Literally everything makes them feel like their value drops and that they're going to be abandoned and that their identity is in crisis. Okay? And when they try to express this to someone in their life who's not BPD, who's in the, Roddy's saying balanced, who's in the normal range, a normal esteem and validation range, that person is going to have a difficult time empathizing for what they consider to be not a big deal or trivial. Okay? And you can empathize a couple times, and then it comes a point in time when it kind of gets old. Like, I can't keep faking this. You know? And I can't tell you how it's such an exposed nerve. So let me try to give you a couple of examples of how this works. There's a negative inference things that goes on, and there's zero responsibility, so nothing is ever their fault, and there's nothing they can do about it. The fix also has to come from outside, but every fix is bad, and no fix is good enough. Okay, so that's one of the problems. So the negative inference is something like this: you make a positive statement, and they presume that the negative about them is true. Could go a lot of different ways. You could say, I really like your eye makeup today. And they think he hates my earrings. Or they think he thinks I'm ugly without makeup. You see? And it's at this point where it gets to a point where there's nothing good that you can say to them that they don't turn into something bad. A mailman could walk by and say to the neighbor, I really like your Christmas decorations. And they hear, he hates our Christmas decorations. You go to a restaurant. Or if you say, hey, I want to go to that steak restaurant. I haven't been to Saltgrass in a while. Let's go to Saltgrass. They hear, he thinks I'm a terrible cook and doesn't want to eat my cooking. That's what they hear. And the person can only deal with this so much. But no, that's totally not what I meant. I just kind of want to go to Saltgrass. It doesn't mean I don't want, So wow, why are you taking my words and doing that with them? And so you have this, on one hand, everyone's feelings are valid. And on the other hand, the person that they're in a relationship with has a very difficult time keeping up with that much intensity that happens so often all the time for everything. And so you might go to church, and somebody plays the piano beautifully. Wow, they did a really good job on that song. That was amazing. What they hear, because they also play the piano, is he doesn't like my playing. You see? There's no amount of you can't, if you see somebody else doing a good job parenting or they have a good idea, you can't voice it. And what happens is the person winds up, you start holding back on saying anything, because if I say, Like, oh wow, look at what Denise did with her kids. I never really thought about doing that before. What the other person hears is they think I'm a bad parent. That's what they hear. It's not what you said, but that's what they hear. So it's is that a personality disorder? Or is that a case of self-absorption? That's both. Overlap. And so every once in a while there might be a, husbands and wives joke around and about each other a lot. And like right now, my wife, Paula, one of the things that we kind of enjoy to do with each other, we kind of rib each other a little bit. Like we have little insults that we throw at each other. As a matter of fact, the first conversation we had, I told her I like to roast online profiles, and she's like, well, roast mine. So the first thing I said to her was a string of insults, okay? And that's kind of been our relationship ever since. And I don't ever say, I don't like belittle her in public or anything like that, but if I throw a little one-liner out there because it was a good opportunity, she takes it well and gives it right back to me. So she can dish it and take it, I can dish it and take it, and we both like it, we both enjoy it. Well, with a person like that, you can't do any of that. They take everything very personally. They take it very, it's just not a good situation at all. It's almost impossible. It's very difficult to communicate. And I cannot overstate how the most trivial, inconsequential things to you or to a regular person is a huge deal to them. And they are hugely affected by it. Lots of emotions, crying. And because you're in the normal range and they are way down here in this deficit, they perceive you as having no empathy. You don't care about them. You don't care about their situation. And you may try lots of different approaches. Like maybe she's upset about something, you don't really think it's an infraction. So you apologize. And then you start this trend where you start apologizing for all these things, and then like 5 or 10 apologies later, she's like, you don't really mean it, you're just checking a block. Well, that's probably true. Because there's only so many times you can mean it when nothing really serious has happened anyway. Like there's no agreement that something worth apologizing for really happened. It's just how you're taking it. And so if they'll hear, oh, I like your eyeshadow today, and oh, he hates my earrings. Now you have to apologize for insulting her earrings. Well, I don't think I should. I don't think I should have to. I think you should revise what you heard from me to match what I intended. You see? That kind of thing. Look at some of these comments down here. Some of them are kind of hilarious. Yeah, sounds a little toxic, huh? Yeah, mentally, emotionally, physically exhausting for everyone. So the person who's trying to be in a relationship with the cluster B person, it's just absolutely exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting. And you get to the point where you can't feel anymore. The other person needs external feelings from you so much that you've dished them all out and you're depleted and you have nothing left to give. And now, so if you look at the disparity here, let's do this. Let's make a set of arrows that go up and down. From the range of a normal person, like a normal person dealing with a narcissist, you're like, man, they only care about themselves. They don't have any empathy. They can't see someone else's perspective, okay? Down here, the disparity is so far from normal that's their perception of you. That's the borderline's personality, the S prime going on there. Their assessment of you is that you have no empathy, you can't see anybody else's perspective, because they need so much and you have been depleted of everything that you have to give. There's nothing left to give. It's just not there. And now you're trying to go through the motions of how do I interact with this person in a way that doesn't set them off? which brings up another book title called Walking on Eggshells, which is what it's like. You're constantly walking on eggshells. Now, if you take this over to the religious domain, what you'll notice is that all these points of sensitivity, they manifest themselves in religious radicalism as well. There's all kinds of things that have to be gotten exactly right. And anything could be epistemically wrong or morally wrong or for the wrong intent or motive or pride. There's always some way you can paint somebody as wrong. And you can outgroup them, and you can get rid of them. You can kick them out of your church, or you can ostracize them, or you can make them follow the rules, make them toe the line. You can be in control, okay? So there's the same kind of functional thing that's going on there. And then there's zero responsibility. They absolutely, the biggest problem with a cluster B person is that absolutely nothing is their fault. You can't, and I only know of one case where a person has borderline personality disorder and they are diagnosed and they know it and admit it and are doing something about it and recognize that some stuff is their fault. And they're actually okay to be around. They have a flare up every now and then maybe, but they're okay to be around. They're fun to be around. They know it. They deal with it. It's fine. It's good. But most of the time, you're dealing with somebody who's in denial. It's not their fault. And the mere suggestion. And what do you say to somebody? Because if you tell somebody they need help, that's just what a narcissist would say. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place on what to do about it when you think somebody's got this issue. Now, well, I won't even get into some of that. But I'll just say this. I'll just say that I was turned on to this book in 2020. And it had so much explanatory power. And once I started seeing some of the patterns, then I start to see how it comes over into the religious realm. Now, something else. On the big five, okay, over here on the lower right-hand side. On the big five, they are high in neuroticism typically, and they're very high in agreeableness. You would think the high in agreeableness would be good, that would resolve some of the issues, but it's a very surface level agreeableness, okay? They're not agreeable that anything is their fault, but they're very agreeable to the degree of, like, say you're at church. Say they have planned to cook a big meal that afternoon for when you get home from church. But someone calls them, hey, the piano player is out sick. Can you fill in for her? Yes. Oh, this Sunday school teacher is out sick. Can you fill in for her? Yes. So now they've signed up for a couple of things, and they got to come home and cook, even though they agreed to do all that. And then about 7 p.m., they are ready to just destroy the entire world because nobody understands what they're going through, and they just have it terrible, and they need a break, and they need to get away. Well, they said yes to too many things, so they don't have good boundaries. They don't know when to say no, too agreeable. They exploit other people who don't have good boundaries by sucking them dry of their external validation that they need from them, especially children. So they're saying yes, 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 yes to everything, and what that does, pretty soon they're overworked without a break, and they start to get resentful. Now they're resentful. The church is asking them to do all this stuff. The family needs to be fed. They're saying yes to all this stuff. They have very little capacity to predict that they should probably say no and not do some things. They don't realize the future debt of action they're putting themselves into by saying yes to so many things. And as all these bills become due, where I know you're tired, you just taught the Sunday school class, but now you got to play the piano, and I know you're tired, but you said you were going to cook this dinner, and now everybody's relying on that sort of thing. It builds up, and pretty soon they feel like everyone's taking advantage of them. They feel like nobody understands how much they do for everybody else, and they start to get resentful, and that resentful goes in all directions. And remember, nothing is their fault, okay? So this is a big problem. So what that resentment does, and you may have heard me say this before, is that resentment is if your mind is a fractal version of the entire cosmos, resentment is the devil in that it is the father of all lies. It's the father of all deception, and it's the usurper of all other kinds of order and diligence and will and conscientiousness that might be otherwise be taking place in the mind. It takes over. Okay? It's the father of all lies. So what does resentment do? And I'll explain some of this in a minute with this guy on the pedestal and the other guy falling off. Resentment causes people, and this happens for anybody, personality disorder or not, which is why the Bible calls it bitterness. But this is why the Bible is very serious about bitterness, like in the end of Ephesians chapter 4. Notice we have our edification model in chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. And then we have a lot of other considerations that he's not done talking about the edification model yet. So you cannot let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Okay? Or to word it as Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachenberger say, in order to participate in game B, you need to be post-naive and post-cynical and healed from trauma. Okay? Genuinely healed from trauma. Another way to say not harboring bitterness and resentment. So the bitterness, Ephesians 4, 31, 32, be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. The resentment, bitterness, causes people to justify narratives, or to, I meant to say entertain. Entertain narratives that justify the resentment, okay? So, if you are resentful because the pastor asks you to play the piano, and then someone tells a little dirty white lie about the pastor, you are more prone to believe that little white lie because you're already resentful. You divorce your husband. This is another couple that I know. They got divorced, and then the wife is like, I think my husband was poisoning me this whole time. Husband was not poisoning her the whole time. But the resentful mind tends to entertain narratives that justify the resentment. And what happens is those narratives, the threshold of truth gets more and more relaxed for the narratives that you're willing to entertain. Resentment can be so strong that the person has filled their heads with all sorts of non-truths in order to justify the resentment. I want to hate them, and I have really good reasons to hate them. Well, maybe you only have one good reason, and the other, you got 50 good reasons to hate them. Maybe only one of those are good, and the other 49 are completely made up. Just absolutely, completely made up. What does that do? That puts the person in a type of psychosis to where they are completely living in a narrative that is an absolute lie, which is why it's so important for them to suck people into their narrative and into their lie and to participate in the lie, because they have to keep it real to themselves. They have to keep that lying narrative, keep manifesting itself to them. Now, the religious person does this too. While the religious fundamentalist surrounds themselves by people that they agree with. I was in a independent fundamental Baptist church, and if you weren't premillennial, pre-trib, you couldn't be in the church. It had to be an echo chamber. Why? Because they're so insecure with the fake reality that they've created that they have to surround themselves with an echo chamber as a little security blanket to prevent themselves from coming to the cognitive level of awareness that what they're peddling isn't true. That's what's going on. So that brings us to, what does the term borderline mean? Borderline, what is the border? Okay? So the borderline is on neuroticism. Okay? I have like a popcorn kernel or something. Neuroticism and psychosis. Now, this brings me to a point of disagreement that I had. I was having a conversation with a therapist, and this therapist saying, I will not see borderline patients because they suck you in and you can't really help them. Can't help them. Okay? Well, the disagreement we had, and I agree with that. I agree with that. The disagreement we had was about whether or not they actually come to believe the lies. This person was like, no, they make all these lies up and they know that they're lies, and that's why they work so hard to defend them. And I'm kind of the opinion that if you lie so much, you start to believe the lie and you start to functionally, your reality gets so shaped by the lie that it is at least functionally no different. And I think at some point in time, you become unaware of the difference between what is the lie and what is the truth, because you're living in this constructed false narrative. It's basically like a VR headset. Now notice how this language is the same. If you're an ideologically possessed religious fundamentalist, you've created a worldview that's like a religious VR headset. And the reason they're so hardcore about having all the right beliefs and making everybody believe and affirm all the right things is because they know it's a lie. Or because they know deep down they don't have any confidence of the truth in it. They can't let it go and it still be true. Like if they aren't there to batten down the hatches and keep it true, it won't stay true. That's where a fundamentalist is. If something's true, it doesn't need me to hold it there to be true. You see, it's just going to be true. It doesn't need me. It just is. And the reason the fundamentalists are so concerned about believing and defending all the right things is because there's this unstated subconscious belief, basically, that those beliefs need those people to hold all those beliefs in place so they don't float away and go away and die, because they can be lost forever. And then we're so out of touch with reality, we'd never rediscover them again. I don't think truth is that fragile. I think that truth is going to be there all the time, whether I hold it down there or not. Okay? So the borderline person, they have a fabricated reality, and they have to hold those truths in place. And there's some debate over whether or not they actually come to believe those, or whether or not they know they're still lies. But that is the psychosis part, is they construct what essentially becomes an alternate reality which isn't true, and that's the reality that they functionally live in. So it's like a fabricated psychosis. It's not a psychosis of like a type A person who is seeing and hearing things illusorily, an illusion. So it's not that. It's a fabricated psychosis that is essentially born from resentment. So what am I trying to depict up here? Let me take it to another slide. There's something called splitting. Now, splitting is very, very important. And this is very big in fundamentalism too. That is, when you are the good guy, you're up on the pedestal. You get all the praise. You are just wonderful. You can do no wrong. You are the hero. You are amazingly the hero. But and this is their perception of you. If you in other words, so the borderline person and the narcissist, cluster B people will put people up on a pedestal. And as long as you're up on that pedestal, you are numero uno, you are golden, you are the king, you're wonderful, you receive all the praise. As soon as something puts you off that pedestal, everything is bad. You are now effectively the devil, and there's no place of repentance for you. There is no coming back. And all the memories of the past of you being Mr. Good Guy in the past, those are all rewritten in terms of the resentment that knocked you off the pedestal. So now you're off the pedestal. Thanks for the super chat, Seraphim. He says the last 5 minutes are worth $5,000. Amazing show. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. So that's $5 for the last 5 minutes. Appreciate that super chat there. And I'm hoping this is helpful to some people. So once you're knocked off the pedestal, you're done. Your goose is cooked. They will never think highly of you again. Now, kids do this. And it's appropriate for kids to do this. The fact that a grown adult is doing this is a feature of neoteny, okay? Neoteny is extended infancy, is what neoteny is. When I was a kid, I was in an independent Baptist church. I'm 4 and 5 years old. I remember going to the grocery store and seeing a guy with short haircut, and I presumed that he was saved and going to heaven because his haircut was right, and he was dressed appropriately, had closed-toed shoes, belt, shirt tucked in, collared shirt, all that kind of stuff. I see a guy that's got a mustache and long hair down to his collar. He's probably unsaved and going to hell. He needs Jesus. See a guy with a beard. He's unsaved, going to hell, needs Jesus. Guy smoking a cigarette, unsaved, going to hell. He needs Jesus. Guy says a cuss word, unsaved, going to hell. He needs Jesus. Splitting. It's all good, all bad. There's no such thing. I think my wife has a shirt that says, "I love Jesus and I cuss a little." There's no such thing as that when you're splitting. It's all good or all bad. There's no such thing as a Christian who loves the Lord but also isn't premillennial pre-trib, or who doesn't believe in eternal security. I mean, like, you got to find a way. Like, people who don't believe in eternal security, they believe in work salvation, and they're working to earn their way to heaven. They're not trusting Jesus, which means they're not really saved. I mean, like, all these things worked out like this, you know. It's splitting. And so the fundamentalist viewpoint, it's all good or all bad. It's splitting. And that's not good, to quote Jordan Peterson. So a person who's married to a borderline person, they may spend 16 years like this. They may spend 43 years like this. They're on the pedestal. Something happens one day, you get knocked off the pedestal, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like a different person. Now the whole time, that whole 16 years, people try to tell you things. They're like, something a little off. Are you sure they're okay? They seem kind of fake, something like that. And you don't see it. You're like, wow, these people are crazy. They're jealous or whatever. I don't know. And then one day, you're off the pedestal. And then you start seeing what all those other people saw all those years. And you're like, wow, they were right. They were right. I totally never saw it before. Well, it's because what you were getting the angel version of them. Okay? So splitting is a huge deal. So what happens up here is, here's the person on the pedestal. Now when that person teeters and falls off the pedestal, now they're resentful against them. And that's where the resentment causes people to entertain narratives that justify the resentment. In other words, letting you be redeemed at all. I mean, I had somebody telling me, I forgive you, but that doesn't mean we're reconciled. Okay, so it's like there's no path to true peace. True peace. Now, that's one thing I enjoy about my current relationship with Paula, is that we have true peace. And what that means is that we have been through some very serious challenges that really challenged our relationship. Okay? And right now, we can bring those up, and neither one of us spiral into like reliving the hurt and the pain and the fear and the insecurity or any of that. Okay? Nobody does that. We can mention it, laugh. We can mention the surrounding events and laugh. And it's really good. It's really peaceful. It's not like this area that's in an enclave that can't be mentioned, So, seeing some of these comments, some of these guys are silly. So once you get knocked off the pedestal, there's no coming back up, and the splitting starts. I forget what I was just saying a second ago, but I bet it was pretty good. Now, I'm going to start talking about the ego for a few minutes. Let me look at some of my other slides and see where I want to go. Okay, yeah. And we're almost done. I want to talk about the word ego for a few minutes. And I'll show you some pretty pictures. They're going to be nice. And I think what I'm going to show you in a minute, I'm going to show you this little diagram here and talk through it. And when I talk, I think this is going to be very, very helpful for you to understand what's going on with religious fundamentalists and with, cluster B personality disorders. So, and thanks, Infamintorio. He says, I really appreciate you. Thank you. I appreciate that. The way I use the word ego here, I'm not talking about people who are conceited or arrogant, although those aren't ruled out either. But the way I'm using the word ego is to refer to your perception of your own identity that is formed through your emotional attachments to things, people, concepts, and the security that you feel from those concepts. Now, you may say, well, I'm not attached to anything, but we are. We're attached to things. There's things that we like, right? I had a truck recently. I traded my truck in and got something else. And the newer vehicle is better in a lot of ways, but I had an ego attachment to my truck, and I kind of miss it, all right? I'm not going to get it back, and I'm going to be okay, but I had a little bit of attachment there. And I think awareness is the biggest thing too. You may not be able to sever all of your attachments, but a starting point for ego work is to start to become aware of what they are. And don't feel like you have to break that and loose yourself of all attachments right away. Start with awareness, okay? That sort of thing. So that's the way I'm using the word ego, and the word I really want to hone in on is attachments to things. You have an emotional attachment, and you form your identity with that. Like, I am the guy everyone knows me as the guy who drives up in the blue truck. I don't have the blue truck anymore. So that's like hits me in the identity. And how many other things do we have? So I'm envisioning the ego attachments as spider webs. Okay? And let's pretend also, I'm going to bring in another analogy that I used in another video. Let's pretend also that like the ground is your ultimate ground of being, and you're a spider. And you can never be on the ground, and you can never connect your web to the ground. You can only connect your web to other things that you think are connected to the ground. And you might be wrong. So you can connect your web to, say, the mailbox, or the pillar holding up the porch in the front, or the door. You can connect your web to all these things, or the bush, and then your web gets connected to the car. Well, the mailbox probably isn't moving. The door, the pillar and the porch probably isn't moving. But if you connect your web to the car, it might take off and go. Well, then you've connected your web to something you shouldn't have, and that's a connection that's going to go away. So you better not rely too heavily on that. And so there's this game. I want to be in connection with the ultimate ground of being, which we can represent by the ground, but I cannot connect my web to the ground itself. I can only perceive the ground through the other things that I can connect to. And that's kind of the situation that we're in. If we're trying to perceive ultimate reality, the ground of being, we have all these ego identity attachments, and we kind of have to find the meaning through our interactions and connections that helps us to perceive the ground that we can't touch or directly experience. Something like that's going on. So I got some Pink Floyd going in here now. Build the wall. All in all, it's just another brick in the wall. I got my guitar over here. We can play some of this stuff. So each one of these ego attachments, and we'll talk about a regular person that doesn't have any kind of personality disorder. You have an ego attachment to different things in your life. So I have depicted here, here's a car. I had an ego attachment to my vehicle, to my truck, and now I don't have the truck anymore. I'm kind of feeling that. Maybe your church or your religious affiliation, your synagogue, your mosque, or the denomination, something like that. Your political party. Maybe you're a piano player or a musician or something, and you're attached to the talent that you have or the ability to express yourself through it, you see. You might be attached to your house. I confess I have an ego attachment to my house. Love this house. Maybe you're attached to your sports team down here. Maybe you're a good cook and you're attached to that. Maybe you're attached to, you just have a whole bunch of possessions and things. Maybe you're a hoarder, okay? That's a person with an attachment issue. Maybe you're attached, here's a group of friends. Maybe you have an attachment to your friends. These are all normal, healthy, appropriate attachments to have when people have them, okay? Maybe you're attached to your reputation over here. Maybe you're attached to the particular music genre or genres that you like. You know, if you see somebody walking around in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat with a big belt buckle, they probably like country music. Maybe not 100% of the time, but probably. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. But I've not been one to like country music, but because of some of the places that my friend groups go, I will dress up and play along. And I will wear a cowboy hat and cowboy boots. But then I go home and listen to Dream Theater when it's all over with. These guys, maybe you're attached to your family or your role in the family or the fact that you have a family or the fact that your family's intact or something like that. Maybe you're attached to, maybe you identify with some kind of hardship you have. Maybe you're the person with cancer or fibromyalgia or I don't know, just whatever. And you take that on as an identity. Some people do that. Maybe you're very patriotic and you're attached to the concept of a national identity of some kind. Okay, these are all typical, normal attachments that people have, and you can imagine the different strength levels that people have these on. Right? You might have a very low bond with maybe your sports team. Maybe it's not super important to you, and if your team doesn't go to the Super Bowl, it's okay, and you're not gonna cry or get upset. You know, and you're like, well, it was a good game anyway, but here's your job up here, and maybe you change jobs and it's not that big of a deal, and you change occupations, and it's not that big of a deal. You could have hobbies on here, whatever you like to do. This could be your ego attachments. Now, here's the deal with what I'm going to call middle of the line people, right? This blue line. These comprise your identity, and when these things feel threatened, you feel threatened. You rightly feel threatened. If something's going to happen to your family, oh, that's a big deal. Say you really like a particular genre of music or like a particular singer. Say you like Hank Williams Jr. and somebody says, man, that guy is just trash. He couldn't sing if he stayed up all night with a singing machine. You know, how do you feel when somebody says, think about how your body feels when the thing that you like the most and are attached to and identify with gets insulted or negated or something like that. You're a Republican. How do you feel when people bash Republicans? You're a Democrat. How do you feel when people bash the Democrats? How does that feel in your body? And the way it feels in your body when the thing is negated or attacked is one of the indicators to you of how emotionally attached you are. So when these are part of your identity, one of the reasons people get so upset when people insult their mother or their father is because that's who you are. You're tied very close to your biological identity of who these people are. You wouldn't be here without them. So you feel like your identity is being, attacked, and you need to stand up for the dignity and honor of your family because that's part of your extended ego or super ego, that in society and all that. If enough of these feel attacked, John Vervaeke talks about a domicide. What if all of these went away involuntarily? You lost your job, you lost your family, you lost your sports team, your house, your religion, lost all that stuff. How would you feel? You'd probably feel pretty terrible. If you were just yanked up and moved and stuck in a concentration camp somewhere, how would you feel? Would you be able to Viktor Frankl your way through that? Or not? Some things to think about. Now, a A person with a, so it's normal. It's normal for you if when these things feel threatened, it's normal to react with a little bit of anxiety, increased blood pressure, and you want to defend something or maybe get away from it and avoid the argument, because these things are important to you. And that's okay, and that's normal, right? If enough of them feel threatened, it's what's going on in your body when you are identified with them, the things you're identified with most. What happens in your body is the same thing that happens in your body if you're walking through the woods and you encounter a very dangerous animal that's threatening your life, okay? A big snake going to bite you and kill you, or a bear or a tiger or a lion, something like that, that could just kill you quickly. You go into fight or flight mode, you got to do something. Well, sometimes you feel that way when the things that you like, and religious people will feel this way, if somebody attacks their pet doctrine, or you attacked the rapture or the eternal security or the hypostatic union or the Trinity or whatever. They go into fight or flight mode. That's why people, when I start to mention the Trinity and things like John 8:24, people can't hear what I'm saying because they have an emotional identity attachment to the Trinity doctrine as it's been written by men, apart from whatever we find in the Bible. And they're attached to that egoically. They have an identity, emotional identity attachment to what mere men have written. And that's why they get so upset and can't hear what I say about it. And I know that. And I know that's what's going on when they get all upset. They're not defending any truth. They're not standing up for God. They're not defending the faith. They're being babies. All right? And they're revealing what their emotional attachments are. And they're revealing that Scripture isn't their authority. That's what they're doing. And they're masking it with moral language. Now, here's what you need to understand. There's two things you need to understand. And this I think is going to open up a lot of, this is going to be insightful for you if you can grasp this. These attachments, all these little lines, okay? For a cluster B person, there is a highly increased amount of reliance on them, and there is a highly increased sense of fragility with them. You get that? They rely on them a lot more, and they perceive them to be a lot more fragile. The constant fear of abandonment, constant fear that the thing they like isn't going to be there, or it's under some kind of grave threat of control. Right? What that means is that anything that you encounter has a much more high likelihood of setting them off in fight or flight mode, because all of their attachments are more heavily relied on and they're perceived to be more fragile. So if I go anywhere near the sports team, if I say, oh, their quarterback was injured and he had to sit out, they just might go into a frenzy. They can't, everything is tense and gets you worked up. So to put it in terms of, say, a crossover error rate, what this means is that when it comes to perceived threats and faults and infractions, they have a huge percentage of false positives. But they don't know that. They think they're genuine alarms, but they're false positives. The alarm's going off, nobody's trying to break in. The alarm's going off, nobody has insulted anybody. Okay? But to them, the alarm is going off and there is an imminent threat and something must be done, and they feel it in their body. Now here's what you have to understand, and this is hard to understand. This is hard to understand. The pain and the emotion that they feel is real. It is real. Just because we know what's going on and that it shouldn't be going on and it would be better if it wasn't going on, it is not a logical thing, okay? It's not something that you can overcome with logic. That's what you have to know. You have to know that. So if you're ever dealing with somebody, that's why the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy book is there. If you're ever dealing with that, you have to approach it. You have to help them calm the body down. They need reassurances. They need validation before they can deal with anything else. Now the good news is what we learn from different therapeutic methods is that if somebody admits that they may have an issue and they get diagnosed with, say, borderline personality disorder, there are therapies that can help. They say there's 9 things, okay, and you can look them up on the web that indicate whether or not you have borderline personality disorder. And if you have 5 or more, you qualify for diagnosis. If you have fewer than 5, you're somewhere on the spectrum but don't qualify for diagnosis. What they say is that through certain kinds of therapy, 2 to 5 years, people have reduced the things that qualify them for the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. In other words, they have fewer than 5 of the things manifesting, which is better than 5 or more. And so what I'm trying to say is that there is some kind of hope, okay? But the thing to know is that they're kind of like a walking landmine, because all of these ego attachments, these spiderweb ego attachments that they have, they're constantly feeling tripped, threatened, aggravated, and they heavily rely on them more than people in the blue zone, more than people in the blue zone do. You take someone in the blue zone, you take them out of their church, separated from your church, they're going to be sad for a little while and they're going to find a way to deal with it. This kind of person can go hysterical, okay? Or they're going to shut down and go nihilistic. They're not going to recover. They might not go hysterical. They might not have a big outburst, but they're going to degrade to the point where they're just completely nihilistic and cynical and can't function anymore, okay? And it sort of manifests differently in different people. And that could be with any of the things. Take away any of these things. You go to, like, you're a good cook. This whole negative inference thing is so tough to explain to people what that's like. You go to somebody's house and you compliment them on being a good cook. Oh, this is a really good steak. What they hear is, he doesn't like my cooking. He doesn't think I can cook a good steak. That's what they hear. It's not what you said, but that's what they hear. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, as illogical as that sounds to us, the pain and anxiety that they feel associated with that, they really feel it. They're really experiencing fear and anxiety in their body, and sadness and grief. And they're really feeling it. So there's this balance you need to take where it's very tempting to get upset with them, but they, to some degree, they don't understand what's happening to them, and they can't not feel it. They're going to feel it. And you need some kind of a... So this next one is just, all I've done is change this picture up here. You see me moving this around. So let's take this to the religious realm. In the religious realm, people have the same, and what you could do is you could replace all these kinds of things with different doctrines, right? Well, I have up here an S prime. I can make this an S prime like this. For the Calvinist pastor, let's say, who's borrowing power and borrowing all the different attributes of God, as we've talked about in our other videos. For the Calvinist who's borrowing those aspects of God, they see themselves as the representative of God's truth to all the people in their congregation. So their S prime, their what they think of when you think of them, their version of themselves in your mind is God's spokesman. And they are the ones through whom you learn about God's omnipotence and omniscience and omnipresence and immutability and sovereignty and da-da-da-da-da. It all comes through them. They are the conduit of all these things. And so their self-prime is this spokesman for ultimate morality and ethics and truth and goodness and everything. They feel that they are perceived as God's conduit for all these things to you. And you can imagine how if being ideologically possessed in the first place makes you replicate tendencies of a narcissist, being the guy in power ramps that up. I mean, you should see some of the letters from some of these pastors. And I'm not just talking about Calvinists. I'm not excluding Calvinists. They're very bad offenders too. But like in the independent Baptist realm, in the Calvinist realm, and probably many other places as well, but I can only talk to my experience. But what I'm talking about is that blue, integral spiral blue, or Fowler's stage 3, that ideological possession mixed with a place of authority when you are speaking for God. Oh, that'll really turn somebody into a narcissist. It does, and you wonder why they act like narcissists. I should have brought some letters to read on here, but we've already gotten out of time. So, some key points. We're going to wrap this up. Some key points. We looked at where regular people are, and your narcissist has a very inflated sense of self, and they constantly need external validation. Your borderline personality person has a very deflated sense of self, and they constantly need external validation from other people, which makes it dangerous for people who aren't able to put up boundaries, especially kids. Especially a kid-parent situation, and it's the impulsive empathy of a BPD mother is going to breed a narcissistic child. Things like that are going on, so it's not good for the kids at all. Not good for the kids at all. They need that external validation badly. And because of that, they start to see the normal person, the person in the regulated range, they're more emotionally regulated. They see them as the non-empathetic narcissist type person from their perspective, somebody who just doesn't get me and doesn't see my perspective and has no empathy and is never genuine when they apologize. Because you have run them absolutely, you've sucked them dry. And they have this negative inference thing going on, where anything positive you say is reinterpreted as a negative inference against them. And they take zero responsibility for this. Okay? It's your fault. Like if you complimented Mrs. Smith's meatloaf, and she interprets that as you don't think her meatloaf is good, that's still your fault. It's not their response. They don't have any responsibility for thinking the unintended thing and for not giving you the benefit of the doubt. It's still your fault. Zero responsibility. Absolute zero responsibility. It's very difficult to manage. On the big 5, they have a lot of agreeableness, a lot of neuroticism. The problem with the agreeableness, they say yes to too many things, they overwork themselves, and they become resentful against those things. And that resentment causes them to entertain narratives that justify their resentment, which essentially creates a psychosis reality that they live in. They live in an orchestrated reality that isn't real. So the borderline is between and including neuroticism and psychosis. And there is debate over whether or not these people actually start believing their lies in the psychosis or whether they keep putting up the front, and we covered that. And now you'll notice that when you're dealing with religious ideologues, they are mirroring all these things. They're mirroring all these insecurities. Okay? It's very interesting. We talked about the ego and how all these ego attachments. And those with cluster B personality disorders are much more heavily relied on, and they're much more fragile, which causes them to have a lot more false positives on the threat vector front, which is the same reason fundamentalists tend to have a lot of witch hunts and inquisitions and things like that, because of all these false positives. Same kind of thing is going on there. Talked about self-prime, and what those things mean, and how you're interpreting yourself. We talked about what splitting is, and we talked about early childhood development, and how when those things go wrong on a consistent basis, we actually turn the next generation into people who also suffer from cluster B personality disorders. People ask me if I suffer from mental illness. And I say, no, I enjoy every minute of it. Okay? And you should too. So let's go ahead and end the video here. I hope you found this helpful for a variety of reasons. If you're going to get married soon, know what you're getting into. Okay? Get a personality test on all these things. Personality things it's something I wanted to add earlier and forgot to. But just like with any other thing, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So whether or not you're using Myers-Briggs or Enneagram or just the Big Five, something like that. And there's, Jordan Peterson also has his own. He says Myers-Briggs is outdated, and he's got his own personality test. Gain some fluency in that. Learn that. Take one. If you're going to be marrying somebody, have them take one. Know what you're getting into. Okay? Know what you're getting into. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting. May the Lord bless you. And good day.